The old grandfather clock in the hall has just struck 9. Outside, the Irish night has settled in with its usual heavy gray weight. The rain is drumming a relentless, hypnotic rhythm against the window pane, blurring the lights of the street below into streaks of amber and gold. It is a night for staying in. It is a night for locking the doors, stirring the embers in the fireplace, and listening to the ghosts of the past. Welcome back to the 9 p.m. Historian. Tonight, we are going to open a dossier that has been sealed with fear, misunderstood by politics, and burned by ideology. We are going to speak about a subject that divides dinner tables and topples governments. It is not a story of a great general, or a fallen empire, or a bloody revolution, though, as you will see, it involves all of those things. It is the biography of a plant. To the botanist, it is known as cannabis sativa. To the politician, it is marijuana. To the jazz musician, it was viper's weed. To the ancient emperor, it was the supreme elixir. And to the modern parent, it is often a source of quiet terror. It is strange, isn't it? How a simple organism, a weed that requires nothing more than sunlight, water, and poor soil to grow, can cast such a long shadow over human history. It is a plant of profound duality. It has been the rope that tethered our ships and the smoke that liberated our minds. It has been a sacred sacrament in the temples of India and a criminal contraband in the alleys of New York. It has been worshipped as a god and hunted as a demon. For the next hour, I want you to forget what you think you know. Forget the headlines of the newspapers. Forget the war on drugs. Forget the stigma in the debates. Instead, come with me. Let us walk backwards through the mist. Let us travel back before the laws were written, before the borders were drawn, to a time when the relationship between man and this plant was fresh, primal, and deeply spiritual. Tonight, we trace the smoke signals across 5,000 years of history. From the frozen steppes of Siberia to the humid jungles of Africa, from the opium dens of Victorian London to the secret jazz clubs of 1920s Harlem. We will uncover why this plant was banned, who profited from its prohibition, and why, after a century of silence, it is finally returning to the light. Settle in. The fire is warm, the story is long, and the history of cannabis is about to begin. Chapter 1. The Ancient Smoke. To find the true origin of our story, we must cast our minds back further than the pyramids of Egypt, further even than the first written words of Sumeria. We must drift back to the end of the last ice age, to the islands we now call Japan. The year is roughly 10,000 BC. The world is a wilder, colder place. Here, a culture known as the Jomon people is beginning to flourish. The word Jomon literally means rope-patterned, named after the distinct markings they pressed into their clay pottery. But what made those ropes? What fiber was strong enough to bind their world together? It was cannabis. For the Jomon, cannabis was not a drug. It was the fabric of life itself. It grew wild and tall in the rich volcanic soil. They used its strong fibers to weave their clothes, to make their bowstrings for hunting, and to construct the nets they cast into the sea. But there is evidence that it was more than just a tool. Archaeologists have found cannabis seeds stored with reverence in Jomon sites. In the ancient Shinto religion, which sees spirits, or kami, in all things natural, the cannabis plant was considered a symbol of purity and fertility. Even today, in the most sacred Shinto shrines in Japan, the thick ropes that hang above the entrance and the ceremonial bells are traditionally made of hemp. Before it was a substance to be banned, it was a medium to ward off evil spirits. It was the barrier between the sacred and the profane. But as civilization began to dawn across the Asian continent, the plant traveled west. It crossed the Sea of Japan and took root in the fertile valleys of the Yellow River. It was here, in ancient China, that the plant would receive its first true scientific examination. Imagine the misty bamboo forests of China, nearly 5,000 years ago. Legend tells us of a mythical figure, the Emperor Shen Nong. He is known as the Divine Farmer, the father of Chinese agriculture and medicine. Art often depicts him as a man with a transparent stomach, a magical attribute that allowed him to see exactly how the herbs he ate affected his internal organs. He was the ultimate self-experimenter. Shennong wandered the mountains and valleys, tasting the bark of trees, the roots of flowers, and the leaves of wild grasses. He catalogued them all in the Pen Sao Ching, the great herbal pharmacopoeia. And there, listed among the supreme elixirs of the earth, was a character known as Ma. Ma is the Chinese word for cannabis. The character itself looks like two plants hanging under a shelter to dry. For the ancient Chinese, Ma was a gift of perfect balance, a manifestation of yin and yang. On one side, there was the male plant. It was tall, sturdy, and almost entirely devoid of mind-altering chemicals. It was the yang, the active, the strong. It provided the fibers that clothed the armies of the emperor and the paper upon which the history of China would be written. Indeed, without hemp paper, the administrative genius of the Chinese bureaucracy might never have existed. But then there was the female plant, the yin, the mysterious flowering counterpart. The ancient herbalists noticed that the female flowers were covered in a sticky, glittering resin. They found that this resin, when mixed with wine, possessed a power that bordered on magic. They called this mixture Ma Fei San. Consider the brutality of ancient surgery. If a warrior took an arrow to the gut, or a farmer needed a tumor removed, the pain of the knife was often fatal. Shock would stop the heart before the surgeon could finish his work. But Shennong and his successors discovered that a cup of Ma Fei San could induce a state of profound insensibility. A patient could be cut open, their bones scraped, their flesh stitched, and they would lie still, lost in a dreamless sleep, only to wake up hours later with the work done. It was the world's first general anesthetic. However, the Chinese sages were also keen observers of the human mind. They knew that Ma was not a toy. The ancient texts contained a warning that echoes down through the ages with chilling accuracy. They wrote, "Taking much makes people see demons and throw themselves about like maniacs." They understood the potential for psychosis, for the fracturing of reality that high doses could bring. But the text did not stop at the warning. It offered a tantalizing promise for those who could master the plant. It continued, "But if taken over a long time, one can communicate with the spirits and lighten one's body. See demons or lighten the body. Madness or enlightenment." This inherent contradiction has haunted the cannabis plant for 5 millennia. Is it a poison that drives men mad, as the prohibitionists of the 20th century would claim? Or is it a gateway to the divine? As we leave China and move westward across the vast, terrifying expanse of the Eurasian steppes, we find the answer to that question among a people who feared neither madness nor death. We find the Scythians. If you stood on the grasslands of what is now southern Russia and Ukraine in the 5th century BC, you would hear the thunder of hooves before you saw them. The Scythians were the lords of the horse. They were nomadic warriors, tattooed and terrifying, who struck fear into the hearts of the Greeks and Persians alike. The Greek historian Herodotus, a man who dedicated his life to recording the strange customs of foreign lands, wrote of them with a mixture of horror and fascination. He recounted tales of Scythians drinking the blood of their fallen enemies, from skulls gilded in gold. But Herodotus also recorded a ritual that was not about war, but about grief. Life on the steppes was hard. Death was sudden. When a Scythian king or high chieftain died, the tribe needed a way to process the overwhelming collective grief, and so they turned to the smoke. Herodotus describes how they would construct small, intimate tents made of thick woolen felt, stretched tightly over wooden poles to create an airtight seal. Into the center of this dark, claustrophobic space, they would carry a brazier containing red-hot stones, heated in a roaring fire until they glowed like the eyes of dragons. Then the warriors would crawl inside. They would huddle together in the darkness, shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with the smell of sweat and leather. One of them would take a handful of cannabis seeds, often with the resinous flowers still attached, and throw them onto the scorching stones. The reaction was immediate and violent. The seeds would crackle, hiss, and explode, sending up thick plumes of acrid white vapor. Herodotus wrote, "It smokes, and sends out such a vapor as no Greek steam bath could surpass." But this was no ordinary steam. As the warriors inhaled the thick fumes, the the chemistry of the plant took hold. The grief of the funeral faded. The harsh reality of the frozen plains dissolved. In that tent, the boundary between the living and the dead became thin. Herodotus noted that the Scythians, delighted by the experience, would shout for joy. For centuries, Victorian historians dismissed this account as a myth. They couldn't believe that these barbarians were using drugs. But archaeology has a way of silencing the skeptics. In 2013, deep in the Altai Mountains, scientists excavated a Scythian burial mound preserved by the permafrost. There, resting for 2,400 years in the dark, were gold vessels containing the charred residue of cannabis and opium. The story was true. For the Scythians, this was not recreation. It was a seance. It was a technology of the soul, used to speak with the ancestors and find a moment of ecstasy in a brutal world. And as the Scythian horsemen rode south, carrying their seeds in saddlebags, they brought the plant to the roof of the world, the Himalayas. And there, cannabis would meet the gods. Chapter 2. The Eastern Mysteries. The Garden of Assassins. As we leave the frozen burial mounds of the Scythians and the wind-swept steppes of Central Asia, our journey follows the plant as it migrates south. It crosses the treacherous, snow-capped peaks of the Hindu Kush and descends into the humid, chaotic, and vibrant subcontinent of India. Here, the plant would shed its primitive associations. It would cease to be merely a funeral incense or a crude medicine. In India, cannabis would ascend to the heavens. It would become a god. To understand the place of cannabis in India, we must look to the Vedas, the sacred Sanskrit texts that form the bedrock of Hinduism, composed as early as 1500 BC. In the Atharva Veda, or the Science of Charms, the ancient scribes listed the 5 most sacred plants on earth. Among the soma and the barley, there was banga. The text calls it a liberator, a source of happiness, and a bringer of freedom. But why was it sacred? The answer lies in the mythology of Lord Shiva, the destroyer, one of the most complex and powerful deities in the Hindu pantheon. Legend tells us of a time when Shiva, after a furious dispute with his family, wandered off into the fields, drained by the scorching heat of the Indian sun. Exhausted and seeking refuge, he collapsed under the shade of a tall, leafy plant. The smell of the plant was distinct, musky, earthy, and sweet. Curious, the god plucked the leaves and tasted them. Instantly, a cool wave of refreshment washed over him. The heat of the sun seemed to distance itself. His anger evaporated, replaced by a profound, meditative stillness. From that day forward, Shiva declared cannabis his favorite food. He became the Lord of Bhang. This is why, for over 3,000 years, the consumption of cannabis in India has not been considered a vice, but a religious act. But notice I said consumption, not smoking. For much of Indian history, the plant was eaten or drunk, not burned. Imagine walking through the narrow, winding streets of Varanasi, the holiest city on the banks of the Ganges, during the festival of Holi. The air is filled with clouds of colored powder, red, blue, pink, and the sound of laughter. On the street corners, vendors are stirring large clay pots filled with a thick, green, milky liquid. This is bhang lassi. It is a potent preparation. The female flowers and leaves of the cannabis plant are harvested and placed between 2 heavy stones. They are ground down, hour after hour, into a fine green paste. This paste is then mixed with milk, ghee, clarified butter, sugar, almonds, and spices like cardamom and ginger. The result is a drink that does not hit the user with the sudden, sharp impact of smoke. Instead, it enters the body slowly, metabolizing in the liver, creating a long-lasting, heavy, full-body trance. For the sadhu, the holy ascetic who has renounced all worldly possessions, this trance is essential. If you travel to the banks of the Ganges today, you will see them. Men with matted dreadlocks, their bodies smeared in white ash to represent the death of the ego, sitting in the lotus position for hours or even days. In their hands, they hold a clay pipe known as a chillum. When they raise the pipe to their lips, they do not do so for pleasure. They chant Om Namah Shivaya, I bow to Shiva. and inhale the harsh smoke to disconnect their consciousness from the pain of hunger, the bite of the cold, and the suffering of the material world. For the sadhu, cannabis is the vehicle that carries the soul across the ocean of illusion. However, the Indian relationship with the plant was not just spiritual, it was deeply medicinal. The Ayurveda, the traditional system of Indian medicine, classified cannabis as distinct from other drugs. They called it the penicillin of the Ayurvedic world. It was prescribed for everything, mostly for digestion, but also to sharpen the memory, to cure leprosy, and interestingly, to stimulate the libido. It was seen as a heater of the body. But the Ayurvedic doctors, like the Chinese before them, knew the dangers. They warned that while it was a giver of joy, excessive use by a weak mind would lead to a loss of the self. It was a tool for the wise, but a trap for the fool. As the centuries turned into millennia, the trade routes of the Silk Road carried the secrets of Bhang westward, out of the spiritual cradle of India and into the harsh, geometric beauty of the Islamic world. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the Islamic Golden Age was in full bloom. From Baghdad to Damascus, scholars were translating Aristotle, mapping the stars, and inventing algebra. But socially, the Islamic world was governed by the Quran, which strictly forbade the consumption of khamr, intoxicants, specifically alcohol. Wine was the drink of the infidel. But what of the green plant from the East? The Quran was silent on the specific subject of cannabis, and in that silence, a culture flourished. The Arabs did not drink bhang like the Indians. They were alchemists. They wanted to refine the essence of the plant. They developed a technique to harvest only the glittering resin glands, the trichomes, that covered the female flowers. By rubbing the plants between their hands or sieving them through silk cloth, they collected a sticky brown powder which they pressed into blocks. They called it hashish, a word that simply means grass or dry herb in Arabic. Hashish was far more potent than the raw plant. It became the social lubricant of the Middle East. While Europeans sat in taverns drinking ale, the poets and mystics of the Middle East sat in coffee houses, eating small balls of hashish and debating philosophy. The Sufi mystics, the whirling dervishes, used it to spin themselves into a state of ecstatic communion with Allah. But it is here, in the mountain ranges of Persia, around the year 1090 AD, that the history of cannabis takes its darkest and most legendary turn. It is here that the plant sheds its image as a medicine and a sacrament, and puts on the mask of the killer. This is the legend of the Hashishin. High in the Alborz Mountains of modern-day Iran, perched on a rock so steep it was said only eagles could reach it, stood the fortress of Alamut. It was the headquarters of a radical Ismaili sect, led by a brilliant, ruthless strategist named Hassan Isabah, known to history as the Old Man of the Mountain. Hassan was surrounded by powerful enemies, the Seljuk Turks and the Abbasid Caliphate, who commanded armies of thousands. Hassan had no army. He had only a handful of followers. He realized he could not win a war on the battlefield, so he invented a new kind of warfare: targeted political assassination. But to convince a young man to walk into a sultan's court, stab a powerful leader, and inevitably be killed by the guards, Hassan needed more than loyalty. He needed fanaticism. He needed to hack the human mind. The legend, famously recounted by Marco Polo, goes like this. Hassan built a secret garden behind the walls of Alamut. It was a masterpiece of engineering, filled with lush fruit trees, rivers flowing with milk, honey, and wine, and populated by beautiful young women who sang and played music. It was a literal recreation of the paradise promised in the Quran. He would take young, fit recruits, aged between 12 and 20. He would give them a potent potion, which Marco Polo explicitly identified as a concentrated form of hashish. The drug would knock them unconscious. While they slept, they were carried into the secret garden. When they awoke, the hashish would still be affecting their minds, making colors brighter and sensations more intense. They would wander the garden, fed by the women, believing they had truly died and entered heaven. After a few days of this bliss, they were drugged again and dragged back to the cold stone reality of the fortress. When they woke up, confused and heartbroken at the loss of paradise, Hassan would tell them, "I have the power to send you back, But first, you must do my bidding. You must kill this target. If you survive, you will return to the garden. If you die, my angels will carry you there." Armed with this promise, the Hashishin, or assassins, became the most feared killers in the medieval world. They struck with a calmness that terrified their enemies. They did not run after the kill. They stood and waited to be martyred. Now, modern historians debate the accuracy of this story. Many argue that hashish, which is a sedative, would make for a terrible assassin's drug. It makes you sleepy and hungry, not violent. It is more likely that the story was a smear campaign invented by Hassan's enemies to discredit his followers as drug-addled madmen. But in history, the truth often matters less than the myth. The story traveled back to Europe with the Crusaders. The word hashishin entered the French and English languages, eventually mutating into the word we use today for a political murderer: assassin. The damage was done. In the Western mind, the connection was forged. Cannabis was no longer a plant of peace. It was a drug of violence, fanaticism, and mind control. While the assassins were fading into legend, the plant continued its march. It traveled south, carried by Arab traders on dhow ships sailing down the Swahili coast of East Africa. It landed in Zanzibar and Mozambique, and from there it penetrated deep into the heart of the continent. In Africa, the plant found a new name, daga. And it was in Africa that the technology of smoking truly evolved. While the natives of the Americas had tobacco pipes, the people of southern Africa invented the earth pipe. They would dig a small tunnel in the ground, place burning cannabis at one end, and inhale the smoke from the other, often using water to cool the hot fumes. This was the great-grandfather of the modern bong. But the most fascinating African chapter of this story takes place in the Congo Basin in the mid-19th century, involving a tribe known as the Bashilanje. The Bashilanje were a violent, warlike people. They lived by the spear, constantly raiding their neighbors. But around 1850, a cultural revolution swept through the tribe. They discovered cannabis. They formed a new religious cult called the Bena Riamba, which translates to the Sons of Hemp. The change was miraculous. The cult declared that all members were brothers. They burned their weapons in great ceremonial bonfires. They stopped eating human flesh, a practice that had been part of their war rituals. They instituted a legal system where fines were paid in hemp. For the Bashilange, cannabis was a peacemaker. In their nightly councils, the men would sit in a circle, passing a giant gourd pipe. They believed that the smoke connected their minds, making it impossible to lie or harbor hatred against a brother. It was a utopia built on smoke. But like all utopias, it was fragile. When the European colonizers arrived, specifically the Belgian forces of King Leopold II, they looked upon the Bena Riamba with disdain. They saw a lazy, pacified people who spent too much time dreaming in the smoke and not enough time working in the rubber plantations. The Europeans dismantled the cult, forced the tribe back into labor, and demonized the plant that had brought them peace. By the end of the 19th century, the stage was set for a global conflict. The plant had circled the world. In India, it was a god. In Persia, it was a weapon. In Africa, it was a peacemaker. But in Europe and America, it was about to become something else entirely. It was about to become a scapegoat. As the 20th century dawned, the ancient smoke was about to meet the cold, hard steel of modern law. The era of the drug was beginning. Chapter 3. The European Awakening. The Green Fairy. As the 18th century drew to a close, the map of the world was being redrawn by gunpowder and ambition. The great European powers, Britain and France, were stretching their tentacles into the east. And as they conquered new lands, they were conquered, in turn, by new habits. For centuries, Europe had been a continent of alcohol. From the ales of England to the wines of France, the European mind was drowned in fermentation. Cannabis was known only as a rumor, a distant legend brought back by travelers like Marco Polo, whispered about as the drug of the assassins. It was a myth, not a reality. But that changed in 1798. And it changed because of one man, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon had invaded Egypt, aiming to cut off Britain's trade route to India. His soldiers, thousands of Frenchmen accustomed to their daily ration of wine, found themselves stranded in an Islamic country. Egypt was dry. Alcohol was forbidden by the Quran and was nearly impossible to find. But the French soldiers found something else in the bazaars of Cairo and Alexandria. They found dark, sticky slabs of hashish. The soldiers, desperate for any escape from the heat, the disease, and the brutality of war, began to consume it voraciously. They didn't smoke it. They ate it, or mixed it into their coffee. The effect on the army was noticeable. The fighting spirit dulled. A strange lethargy spread through the ranks. Napoleon, a man of strict discipline, was furious. In October 1800, he issued one of the first drug prohibition laws in modern history. He declared, "The use of the strong liquor made by some Muslims with a certain weed called hashish, and the smoking of the seed of hemp, are prohibited throughout Egypt." He ordered all cafes selling it to be walled up and bricked over. But it was too late. You cannot ban a sensation. When the French troops eventually returned to Marseille and Paris, they brought the habit with them. They carried the green jam in their knapsacks, not as a spoil of war, but as a secret souvenir of the Orient. And so the plant arrived in the heart of Western civilization. But it did not arrive on the streets. It arrived in the salons of the intellectual elite. If you were a writer, a poet, or a painter in Paris in the 1840s, there was only one place to be: the Hôtel de Lauzun on the Île Saint-Louis. Climb the winding stairs to the apartment of the painter Fernand Boissard, and you would find yourself in a world of red velvet, gold trim, and heavy curtains that shut out the gray Paris sky. The air was thick with perfume and the smoke of strong tobacco. This was the meeting place of Le Club des Hashichines, the Club of the Hashish Eaters. The club was founded by a doctor, Jacques-Joseph Moreau de Tours. Moreau was the first psychiatrist to study drugs systematically. He theorized that insanity was not a disease of the brain, but a different state of consciousness. He believed that by taking hashish, he could induce a temporary, controlled madness, allowing him to understand his patients from the inside out. He recruited the greatest minds of his generation to be his guinea pigs: Victor Hugo, Alexandre Dumas, Honoré de Balzac, and the dark prince of French poetry, Charles Baudelaire. They did not smoke the plant. They viewed smoking as crude. Instead, they consumed a confection known as dawamesk. Imagine a greenish jam. It was a potent mixture of hashish resin, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, pistachio, sugar, orange juice, and butter. It tasted sweet, spicy, and exotic. Dr. Moreau would hand out spoonfuls of this jam from a crystal vase, saying, "This will be your share of paradise." The writers documented their experiences with obsessive detail. Their descriptions are some of the most beautiful and terrifying in literature. Théophile Gautier wrote of his first experience. "My hearing acquired marvelous powers. I heard the noise of colors. Green, red, blue, and yellow sounds came to me in distinct waves." This is a perfect description of synesthesia, the crossing of senses. But Charles Baudelaire, the melancholic author of Les Fleurs du Mal, saw the darker side. He called the drug a weapon for suicide. He wrote, "The external world is repulsed. The man is no longer a man, but a god, but a lonely god." For these romantics, cannabis was not a party drug. It was a tool for exploring the abyss of the human soul. It was gothic. It was dangerous. It was sublime. But while the French poets were chasing ghosts in the shadows of Paris, across the English Channel, the pragmatic British were turning the plant into something far more mundane. They were turning it into a pill. The man responsible for medicalizing cannabis was an Irish physician named William Brooke O'Shaughnessy. Working in Calcutta in the 1830s, he observed how Indian doctors used cannabis to treat convulsions and rheumatism. Unlike the French, who were interested in art and philosophy, O'Shaughnessy was a man of science. He conducted experiments, first on dogs, then on patients. He found that cannabis extracts could stop the violent seizures of infants. He found it could stop the muscle spasms of tetanus and rabies, allowing patients to die in peace rather than in agony. He brought his findings back to London in 1842, and the medical establishment embraced it with open arms. From 1850 to 1900, this was the golden age of medical cannabis in the West. It wasn't a drug in the illicit sense. It was medicine. If you walked into a pharmacy in London, New York, or Boston in 1880, you would see rows of amber bottles labeled Extractum Cannabis Indica. Major pharmaceutical companies like Eli Lilly and Puck Davis, now part of Pfizer, grew tons of it. You could open a Sears Roebuck catalog and order cannabis tinctures by mail, right alongside your new corset or hammer. It was prescribed for migraines, for insomnia, for stomach cramps, and for melancholia. And the most famous patient of all? The monarch herself. Legend, supported by court records, tells us that Sir J. Russell Reynolds, the personal physician to Queen Victoria, prescribed cannabis tinctures to Her Majesty to ease the pain of her menstrual cramps. Reynolds famously wrote in the medical journal The Lancet in 1890, "When pure and administered carefully, cannabis is one of the most valuable medicines we possess." Think about that image for a moment. The Queen of England, the symbol of propriety, the head of the largest empire in history, taking cannabis to soothe her pain. It was not seen as a vice of the lower classes. It was not seen as a corrupter of youth. It was as normal as aspirin is today. So what happened? How did we go from the Queen's medicine cabinet to the devil's lettuce? How did a substance that was celebrated by the greatest poets and doctors of the 19th century become the most hunted plant of the 20th? The answer does not lie in science. It does not lie in medicine. It lies in a new force that was rising across the Atlantic Ocean. A force driven by racial tension, political ambition, and the need for a new enemy. The era of the European awakening was ending. The era of the American demon was about to begin. And the first casualty of this new war would be the name of the plant itself. The world was about to forget cannabis. They were about to learn a new word. Marijuana. Chapter 4. The American Demon. The Murder of a Word. As the 20th century dawned, the focus of our story shifts across the Atlantic, leaving behind the velvet salons of Paris and the pharmacies of London. We land in the dusty borderlands between Mexico and the United States. It is here, in the shadow of a violent revolution, that the modern war on drugs was born. And it began not with the discovery of toxicity, but with a linguistic murder. For centuries, Americans had known the plant as hemp, or cannabis. It was a crop grown by George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. It was a tincture found in every doctor's bag. It was familiar. It was domestic. It was safe. But in 1910, the Mexican Revolution erupted. It was a bloody, chaotic civil war that sent shockwaves north. Thousands of refugees fled the violence, crossing the border into Texas, Louisiana, and California, seeking safety and work. They brought with them their culture, their food, and their customs. And one of those customs was smoking the dried flowers of the cannabis plant in cigarettes to relax after a long day of labor in the fields. They didn't call it cannabis. They called it by a slang term used by the soldiers of Pancho Villa, marijuana. There is a famous Mexican folk song from this era that you have likely heard 1,000 times, perhaps in a cartoon or a comedy sketch. It is called La Cucaracha, the cockroach. The chorus goes, La cucaracha, ya no puede caminar. ¿Por qué no tiene, por qué le falta, marihuana que fumar? Translation: the cockroach can no longer walk, because he doesn't have, because he lacks, marijuana to smoke. To the Mexican soldiers, it was a song about resilience and camaraderie. But to the white, conservative population of the American South, hearing this strange word, marijuana, whispered in the camps of the migrant workers, it sounded like a threat. In the 1910s and 20s, America was a cauldron of racial tension. The white establishment, fearful of the influx of brown-skinned immigrants, began to look for reasons to police and control them. They couldn't outlaw being Mexican, but they could outlaw their habits. Local newspapers, eager to sell copies, began to run sensational stories. They didn't warn the public about cannabis medicine. That would have confused people who had it in their medicine cabinets. Instead, they warned of a new foreign scourge. They called it the loco weed. They called it the Mexican killer drug. And most effectively, they called it marijuana. By changing the name, they changed the perception. Cannabis was science. Marijuana was a monster. But the local weed didn't stay on the border. It traveled up the Mississippi River, carried by the great migration of culture and music. It landed in the port city of New Orleans, and from there it exploded into the dark, smoky heart of the Jazz Age. If you walked into a speakeasy in Harlem or Chicago in the 1920s, the air would be thick with two things: the smell of illegal alcohol and the sweet, pungent aroma of cannabis. In the jazz world, it was known as muggles, reefer, or viper's weed. The musicians who smoked it called themselves vipers, named after the hissing sound of a sharp inhalation on a joint. Louis Armstrong, the father of jazz, was a proud viper. He wrote in his biography that he preferred marijuana to whiskey. He said, "It makes you feel good, man. It relaxes you. Makes you forget all the bad things that happen to a Negro." For the jazz musician, cannabis was a performance tool. It altered the perception of time. It made the seconds feel longer, allowing the musician to hear more notes in the spaces between the beat. It fueled the frenetic improvisational energy of bebop and swing. But to the white authorities watching from the outside, this was terrifying. Jazz was already seen as dangerous. It was black music that was seducing white teenagers. It was sexual. It was primal. And now they found out that the fuel behind this satanic music was a drug. The narrative began to twist. The newspapers claimed that marijuana didn't just make people high. It made them forget their place in society. It made them uppity. It broke down the racial barriers that segregation fought so hard to maintain. One paranoid headline from the Times screamed, "Marijuana influences Negroes to look at white people in the eye, step on white men's shadows, and look at a white woman twice." The plant was no longer just a drug. It was a threat to the social order. And every great villain needs a hunter. Enter the man who would dedicate his life to destroying the plant. Harry J. Anslinger. Harry Anslinger was the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. He was appointed in 1930, just as the era of alcohol prohibition was crumbling. Anslinger was a bureaucrat of the old school, stern, square-jawed, and deeply ambitious. He was a man who saw the world in black and white. Initially, Anslinger didn't care about marijuana. He famously stated that it was a minor nuisance, not a federal problem. He was focused on heroin and cocaine. But then, his budget was cut. With the end of alcohol prohibition, he needed a new enemy to justify the existence of his department. He needed a new crusade to scare Congress into giving him money and power. And he found the perfect scapegoat in marijuana. Anslinger launched one of the most effective propaganda campaigns in human history. He didn't use science, he ignored it. When 29 out of 30 scientists he surveyed told him that cannabis was relatively harmless, he threw away their reports and kept the one that said it was dangerous. Instead of facts, he used the Gore files. This was a folder on his desk filled with unverified police reports, tabloid clippings, and letters from terrified parents. He collected stories of gruesome violence and attributed them all, without evidence, to marijuana. The most infamous case in the Gore files is the tragedy of Victor Licata. In 1933, in Tampa, Florida, a young man named Victor Licata hacked his parents, 2 brothers, and a sister to death with an axe while they slept. It was a bloodbath. The press went wild. Anslinger seized the moment. He told the nation that Licata was a marijuana addict, and that the drug had induced a homicidal rage. He used the Licata case as his primary evidence for years. The truth? Victor Licata had a long, documented history of severe schizophrenia and insanity in his family. The police had tried to commit him to an asylum a year before the murders, but his parents refused. There was no evidence he had even smoked marijuana on the day of the murders. But the truth didn't matter. The image of the axe-wielding maniac was burned into the American psyche. Anslinger ramped up the rhetoric. He famously testified, "There are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the U.S., and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz and swing, result from marijuana use. This drug causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and any others. He painted a picture of a drug that could turn a good Christian boy into a killer, and a sweet, innocent girl into a fallen woman, with a single puff. This hysteria culminated in the infamous 1936 propaganda film, Reefer Madness. If you watch it today, it plays like a comedy. The acting is wooden, the plot ridiculous. Teenagers smoke a joint and instantly turn into bug-eyed psychopaths, playing piano frantically, running over pedestrians, and killing each other. But in 1936, for a population that knew nothing about the drug, this was not a comedy. It was a documentary. It was a warning. But Anslinger had one problem: the Constitution. The US government didn't actually have the authority to ban a plant or a medicine. That was a state right. So Anslinger had to be clever. He couldn't ban it. He had to tax it to death. He teamed up with powerful allies. Some historians point to William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper tycoon who hated Mexicans and had vast investments in timber forests that competed with hemp paper. Others point to the DuPont Chemical Company, which had just patented nylon and wanted to eliminate hemp fiber as a competitor. Whether it was a grand capitalist conspiracy or just a convergence of interests, the trap was set. It is 1937. The Marijuana Tax Act is presented to Congress. The hearing was short. It was rushed. Few members of Congress even knew what marijuana was. Most thought it was some obscure Mexican vice. They didn't realize they were voting to ban cannabis, the medicine they had likely taken as children. There was only one dissenting voice, one man who stood up to Harry Anslinger. Dr. William C. Woodward, the Legislative Counsel for the American Medical Association, AMA. Dr. Woodward arrived at the hearing angry. He realized that Anslinger had deliberately used the word marijuana in the bill to trick the doctors. Woodward testified, "Marijuana is not a medical term. It is a mongrel word. The burden of this bill is placed heavily on the doctors and pharmacists of this country. We do not know of any evidence that there is a plague of addiction." He essentially shouted, "You are banning cannabis, our medicine." But Anslinger was ready. He attacked Woodward's character. He told the committee, "The doctor is trying to obstruct justice." He read from his Gore files. He told them about the axe murders. He told them about the corruption of children. Fear won, logic lost. Anslinger told the committee, "If the monster is not destroyed, no one is safe." The bill passed. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 was a masterclass in bureaucratic entrapment. Strictly speaking, it didn't make cannabis illegal. It simply required anyone growing, selling, or prescribing it to buy a tax stamp from the government. But here was the catch. To get the stamp, you had to declare that you possessed the drug. But possessing the drug without the stamp was a crime. Furthermore, Anslinger simply refused to issue any stamps. It was a catch-22. You couldn't get the stamp without the drug, and you couldn't have the drug without the stamp. Overnight, the industry collapsed. The hemp fields of Kentucky, which had once produced the finest rope in the world, were burned. The pharmaceutical companies stopped making tinctures. The doctors stopped prescribing it. The, quote, green fairy of the 19th century was dead. In its place stood the, quote, gateway drug. On the day the law went into effect, Samuel Caldwell, an unemployed laborer in Denver, Colorado, became the first person arrested under the new act. He was caught selling 2 joints. He was sentenced to 4 years of hard labor in Leavenworth Penitentiary. The judge told him, "I consider marijuana the worst of all narcotics, far worse than the use of morphine or cocaine." The iron gate had slammed shut. For the next 60 years, cannabis would disappear from the light of day. It would vanish from the pharmacies and the textbooks. But it did not die. It went underground. It moved into the basements of the beatniks. It traveled in the guitar cases of rock stars. It grew in the closets of activists. And as the decades rolled on, the, quote, demon would become the symbol of a new generation. A generation that would look at Harry Anslinger's laws and say, no. But before the counterculture could rise, the world had to go to war. And in the jungles of Vietnam, the American relationship with this plant would take another strange, hallucinogenic turn. Chapter 5. The Culture War. The Schedule 1 lie. For nearly 2 decades after Harry Anslinger's victory in 1937, cannabis went underground. It disappeared from the pharmacy shelves and the public conversation. It became a ghost, haunting the fringes of society. It was the secret of the jazz musician in the basement club. It was the vice of the Mexican laborer in the field. To the average suburban family living the American dream of the 1950s, with their white picket fences, gray flannel suits, and martinis, marijuana was something distant and dirty. It was un-American. But in the shadows of New York and San Francisco, a new voice was beginning to mutter. The Beat Generation. Writers like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg were tired of the rigid conformity of post-war America. They were looking for something real. They sought kicks. And in the jazz clubs of Harlem, they found tea. For the beatniks, cannabis was not a way to get wasted. It was a way to deprogram themselves. It was a tool to shatter the stiff, gray reality of the Eisenhower era. In his scroll manuscript of On the Road, Kerouac described the high not as madness, but as a moment of gentle, slowed-down clarity. However, the beats were few. They were the spark, not the fire. The fire would come 10 years later, ignited by their children. The 1960s, the decade that broke the world. Suddenly, the baby boomers, the largest generation in history, came of age. And they looked at the world their parents had built with horror. They saw the Cold War. They saw segregation. They saw the looming meat grinder of Vietnam. And they saw alcohol. Alcohol was the drug of their fathers. It was the drug of the politician, the general, the boss. It was the drug that fueled the angry shout and the bar fight. To reject the establishment, the youth needed a new sacrament. They found it in the dried flowers their parents had banned. Cannabis became the defining symbol of the counterculture. It was more than just a chemical. It was a flag. Passing a joint was a political act. It was a ritual of sharing, of peace, of breaking the law together. It represented everything the establishment hated. It was soft. It was introspective. It was communal. At Woodstock in 1969, 500,000 people gathered in the mud. The air was thick with smoke, but there was no violence. The police were baffled. They were used to whiskey riots. They didn't know how to handle an army of smiling, stoned kids. But while the hippies were smoking for peace in the mud of Woodstock, thousands of miles away, young Americans were smoking for survival in the mud of the Mekong Delta. The Vietnam War was the first war where cannabis played a central role on the front lines. The average combat soldier in Vietnam was 19 years old. He was scared, he was far from home, and he was surrounded by death. Alcohol was hard to carry in the jungle. It was heavy, and clinking bottles made noise. But marijuana? Marijuana was everywhere. It grew wild in the rich soil of Southeast Asia. It was sold in cigarette cartons by local mama-san vendors for $1. It was cheap, it was potent, and it was the perfect escape. A report by the Department of Defense in 1971 estimated that over 50% of American soldiers in Vietnam used marijuana. They developed a unique method of consumption known as the shotgun. A soldier would turn his rifle, usually an unloaded shotgun or an M16, upside down. Another soldier would blow smoke into the open chamber, and the recipient would inhale a massive, concentrated blast of smoke from the barrel. It was a grim irony. The weapon designed to kill was being used to breathe in a moment of peace. For these soldiers, the high was a way to numb the trauma, to forget the friend they lost yesterday, to stop the shaking of their hands before patrol. But when the footage of stoned American soldiers appeared on the nightly news back home, the establishment panicked. It was the ultimate nightmare for the conservative right. The American army, the greatest fighting force in the world, was on drugs. The country was tearing itself apart. Riots in the cities, protests on the campuses, a war that couldn't be won. In 1968, a man rose to power promising to stop the chaos. He promised law and order. His name was Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon hated the counterculture. He hated the protesters, the hippies, the Black Panthers, and the long-haired students. But he couldn't arrest them for free speech. The Constitution protected their right to protest. But he could arrest them for their habits. In 1970, Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act. This is the law that still governs global drug policy today. He needed to categorize drugs into schedules based on their danger. Schedule 1 was the most restrictive: no medical use and high potential for abuse. Schedule 2 was slightly less restrictive: high potential for abuse, but some medical use. Nixon placed cannabis in Schedule 1. Let that sink in. Cocaine and methamphetamine were placed in Schedule 2. Cannabis, a plant that had never caused a fatal overdose in recorded history, was placed in Schedule 1, alongside heroin. Legally, the U.S. government declared that cannabis was more dangerous than crystal meth. But Nixon had a problem. He needed scientific cover. He couldn't just ban it based on his feelings. He needed a report. So he appointed a commission, led by the former governor of Pennsylvania, Raymond Schaefer. It was called the Schaefer Commission. Nixon was confident. He told Schaefer privately, "I want a goddamn strong statement on marijuana that stays just one step short of all-out war." He expected the commission to come back with horror stories, confirming that weed drove people crazy. The Schaefer Commission spent 2 years studying the issue. They looked at the science, they looked at the history, they looked at the sociology. In 1972, they presented their report, titled Marijuana, a Signal of Misunderstanding. It was a bombshell. The report concluded that marijuana was not the killer drug Nixon claimed. It stated, "The actual social cost of possession laws is greater than the cost of the drug itself." It recommended that personal possession should be decriminalized. It essentially said, "Stop arresting kids for this." Nixon was furious. He was recorded on the White House tapes shouting at Schaefer. He threw the report in the trash. He declared, "We need to come down hard on it." He ignored his own scientists. He ignored the truth. He declared a war on drugs. Why? Why would a president ignore his own commission? For decades, we suspected the answer. But in 1994, we got the confirmation. John Ehrlichman, Nixon's top domestic advisor and right-hand man, gave an interview to journalist Dan Baum. In a moment of candid honesty, or perhaps regret, he pulled back the curtain on the entire war on drugs. Listen to his words carefully. They are the key to understanding the last 50 years of suffering. Ehrlichman said, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Did we know we were lying? It wasn't a war on a plant. It was a war on people. But the damage was done. The Controlled Substances Act became the model for the world. The United Nations adopted similar treaties. The American demon went global. From the 1970s through the 90s, the prison population of the United States exploded. Millions of lives were ruined, not by the effects of the drug, but by the effects of the conviction. A felony record meant no job, no vote, no future. The plant that had once connected the Scythians to their ancestors now connected young men to the prison industrial complex. The darkness had won. Or so it seemed. But nature is patient. While the politicians were building prisons, the biologists were looking into the microscope. And deep inside the human brain, they were about to find a secret that no law could suppress. A secret that proved that cannabis was not an invader, but a part of us. Chapter 6. The Molecule of Bliss. The Eternal Return. By the late 1980s, the war on drugs had scorched the earth. The prisons were full. The propaganda was absolute. In the eyes of the law, cannabis was a Schedule I narcotic, a substance with no medical value and a direct path to insanity. The door seemed to be locked forever. But history has a way of finding cracks in the wall, and often the light gets in not through the shouting of a protester, but through the quiet curiosity of a scientist. While the United States was busy arresting teenagers, a chemist in Jerusalem was busy asking questions. His name was Dr. Raphael Mechoulam. Decades earlier, in 1964, Mechoulam had been the first to isolate the primary psychoactive component of the plant. He named it tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. It was a monumental discovery, identifying the engine of the high. But for nearly 30 years, a bigger mystery remained. Why does it affect us? Why does a plant that evolved in the mountains of Central Asia have a specific key that unlocks the human brain? In the early 1990s, Mechoulam's team began to map the human brain in search of a receptor, a landing pad for the drug. What they found changed biology forever. They discovered that the human brain is literally studded with receptors specifically designed to receive cannabinoids. They called them CB1 and CB2 receptors. But this raised a terrifying question for the prohibitionists. Why would God, or evolution, build the human body with a custom-made lock for a banned weed? Nature doesn't waste energy. We don't have receptors for rocks or plastic. We only have receptors for things our body produces itself. Did this mean the human body makes its own cannabis? In 1992, Mechoulam found the answer. He isolated a molecule produced by the human brain that was almost identical in structure to THC. It was a neurotransmitter that regulated mood, memory, pain, and appetite. When he needed to name this new molecule, Mechoulam didn't look to Latin or Greek. He looked to the Sanskrit of ancient India, the land where our story's spiritual chapter began. He named it anandamide. The word comes from ananda, which means supreme bliss, the bliss molecule. This was the smoking gun. They discovered the endocannabinoid system. It is a vast network of chemical signals that acts like a master thermostat for our biology. It maintains homeostasis, balance. When you are too hot, it cools you. When you are in pain, it soothes you. When you are traumatized, it helps you forget. The implications were shattering. The plant was not an alien invader attacking our minds. It was a mirror key. The chemical in the plant, the phytocannabinoid, just happened to fit the lock in our body, endocannabinoid, perfectly. We are biologically wired for this relationship. Dr. Mechoulam famously said, "The plant produces chemicals that mimic us." Science had vindicated the Scythians and the Chinese herbalists. But science alone does not change laws. Laws change only when the cost of maintaining them becomes higher than the cost of changing them. And in the 1980s and 90s, that cost was measured in human lives. The catalyst for legalization did not come from a desire to get high. It came from the desire to die with dignity. The AIDS epidemic of the 1980s decimated the gay community of San Francisco. It was a plague that baffled doctors. Young, healthy men were wasting away, their bodies unable to hold down food, ravaged by the side effects of early, toxic HIV drugs. It was called wasting syndrome. There were no legal drugs that could stop the nausea. Patients were starving to death in their hospital beds. But in the Castro district, a whisper network began. Patients discovered that cannabis, the illegal weed, was the only thing that settled their stomachs. It gave them the munchies. It allowed them to eat. It allowed them to stay alive for one more day. Enter the unlikely hero of this chapter, Mary Jane Rathbun, known to history as Brownie Mary. She was not a drug lord. She was a grandmotherly hospital volunteer in her 70s, with curly white hair and a polyester vest. She began baking hundreds of cannabis-infused brownies in her tiny kitchen and distributing them for free to dying AIDS patients in the wards. The police arrested her 3 times. Imagine the optics. The police hauling a 70-year-old woman to jail for feeding dying men. At her trial, she famously told the judge, "My kids are dying. You can do what you want with me." The public conscience broke. You could demonize a hippie. You could demonize a jazz musician. But you could not demonize Brownie Mary. Alongside her was Dennis Perone, a Vietnam veteran who had seen his own lover die of AIDS. Perone opened the San Francisco Cannabis Buyers Club, the first public dispensary in America. It was illegal. It was an act of civil disobedience. but it forced the issue. In 1996, the people of California voted on Proposition 215. It was the Compassionate Use Act. It passed. For the first time since Harry Anslinger's Tax Act of 1937, the wall was breached. The patient had replaced the criminal. Once the door was cracked open by compassion, capitalism kicked it down. Over the next 2 decades, a domino effect swept the world. Colorado, Washington, Canada, Uruguay, Thailand, Germany, the Green Rush began. We are now living in the era of the Cannabis Corporation. If you walk into a dispensary in Denver or Toronto today, the experience is disorienting for anyone who remembers the old days. There are no shady alleys, there are no Ziploc bags. Instead, it looks like an Apple store. Bud tenders with iPads guide you through a menu of strains with names like Blue Dream and Girl Scout cookies. The product is tested in labs, packaged in child-proof containers, and taxed by the state. It is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It is listed on the stock exchange. CEOs in expensive suits give PowerPoint presentations about terpene profiles and market penetration. The plant has completed its transformation. It started as a sacred sacrament. It became a medicine. It became a demon. It became a symbol of rebellion. And now, finally, it has become the most American thing of all, a commodity. But there is a bitter irony in this new world, a shadow that hangs over the gleaming glass counters of the legal dispensaries. While investors make millions on the stock market legally, thousands of people, mostly poor, mostly black and brown, are still sitting in prison cells for doing the exact same thing 10 years ago. A man can be a CEO today for selling the same plant that got Samuel Caldwell hard labor in 1937. The history of cannabis is not just a history of a plant. It is a history of inequality. The smoke has cleared for some, but the fog remains for others. And so we come to the end of our journey. The clock on the wall approaches 10. The rain is still falling, washing the streets of the modern world outside. We have traveled a great distance tonight. We stood in the funeral tents of the Scythians and watched them speak to their ancestors. We sat in the bamboo forests with Shen Nong as he wrote the first prescription. We walked the ramparts of the assassin's fortress and the velvet halls of the Paris poets. We heard the jazz trumpets of Harlem and the helicopter blades of Vietnam. And we stood in the sterile light of a modern laboratory, looking at the molecule of bliss. What have we learned? Perhaps the most important lesson is that the plant itself has never changed. Cannabis sativa has been the same biological organism for 10,000 years. It has no politics, it has no morality. It does not hate us, and it does not love us. It simply grows, reaching for the sun. The change has always been in us. The plant is a mirror. When the ancients looked at it, they saw God. When the doctors looked at it, they saw medicine. When the politicians looked at it, they saw fear. And when the corporations look at it, they see profit. It is a Rorschach test for humanity. It reveals our anxieties, our prejudices, and our desires. We banned it because we were afraid of the other. We legalized it because we were afraid of death. It has been a long, strange trip, and as the laws continue to change and the smoke continues to rise, one thing is certain. The plant will outlast us. Long after our laws are forgotten, long after our empires have crumbled like the walls of the assassin's fortress, the green shoot will push up through the soil, unfold its serrated leaves, and wait for the next traveler to come along. But that is a story for another time. The fire is dying. The dossier is closed. The history is written. Now it is time for the final chapter of the night. Sleep. Good night.